The diesel smell comes first, thick and oily, drifting off a Panther that stopped burning hours ago. It sits nose down in a Lorraine alley in the town of Arracourt, one track peeled off the road wheels, the long 75-millimeter gun pointing at a stone wall it never got to fire through. There is a hole in the side of the turret you could put your fist through. The crew got out. Not all of them. So how does this happen? How does a thin-skinned, open-topped American vehicle, a machine with armor you could defeat with a heavy machine gun, gut one of the best-equipped Panzer brigades the Germans fielded in the West? And why, when the fog lifted over Arracourt in September of 1944, was it Hasso von Manteuffel's armor scattered across the beet fields and not the Americans? The tank that killed this Panther weighed less than the thing it was shooting at. It carried a 3-inch gun in an open turret with no roof. The Germans called their Panther a heavy medium. The Americans called their M18 a tank destroyer, and the men who crewed it called it the Hellcat because it moved. Here's the part that shouldn't be possible. 3 Hellcats, working one narrow corridor of French farmland, tore the head off an armored brigade in a matter of minutes, and the German commander who lost that fight was a man who had learned his trade under Rommel. If you've carried a story like this, a grandfather who crewed a tank destroyer, a letter, a detail nobody ever wrote down, drop it in the comments, because this is exactly where those belong. Subscribe and hit, like so the algorithm hands this to the next person hunting for it. Now, the number 15. That's the count most often attached to what the 4th Armored Division's tank destroyers accounted for in that opening exchange near Arracourt. And the fighting that followed over the next days ran the German losses far higher. The exact figure for that first morning is muddier than the fog that hid it. Sources conflict on the tally, and the after-action reports don't always agree with the veterans who were there. What nobody disputes is the direction of the ledger. The 5th Panzer Army came to Lorraine to cut the 3rd Army's flank, and it left most of a brigade in the mud. You might think armor beats armor, that the thicker plate and the bigger gun win, because that is how the math is supposed to work. The Panther had 80 millimeters of sloped frontal armor and a gun that could kill anything the Americans owned at 2,000 yards. The Hellcat had a fraction of that protection. On paper, it was a slaughter waiting to happen, and the wrong side was supposed to do the slaughtering. The paper was wrong. Not because the Panther was a bad tank. It was a superb one, feared by every American who ever sat across a field from its gun. The Panther lost at Arracourt because it walked into a fight it could not see, run by men who could, in weather that erased every advantage the German machine was built around. One of those German tankers, questioned afterward, kept coming back to the fog. He couldn't understand how the Americans knew where his column was when he could barely see the tank in front of his own. The Hellcat crews weren't guessing. They were listening, waiting, and reading ground they'd already walked, and they were doing it in a vehicle that could reverse out of a kill position faster than a Panther could traverse its turret to find them. That speed is the whole story. And we'll get to exactly what 55 miles an hour buys a crew that knows how to spend it. For now, hold the image. A Panther in an alley, cold now. One clean hole punched through the turret side, where a 3-inch round found it from an angle the crew never expected. To understand how a machine that light killed a machine that heavy, and why it happened here, in this fog, to this brigade, we have to go back a few days, to a bridgehead, a shortage of fuel, and a German plan that was already coming apart before the first shot. What did a Panther crew actually expect when they rolled toward Arracourt that morning? Nothing hard. A road march, a bit of American resistance, a flank turned by nightfall. The 5th Panzer Army had come to Lorraine with orders to slam into Patton's exposed right and cut the 3rd Army loose from its supply, and the men in the turrets had every reason to believe the machine underneath them would carry them through it. That belief was earned. The Panther was, by 1944, the finest medium tank fighting in Europe, and it is worth saying that plainly before we watch it die. Start with the gun. The 75mm KWK-42 was a long, high-velocity weapon that spat an armor-piercing round out of the muzzle at something over 3,000 feet per second. It could punch clean through the frontal armor of a Sherman at ranges where the American crew could barely make out the shape shooting at them. German gunners trained on the idea that they killed first and killed far, and against most of what the Allies fielded, the idea held. Then the armor, the thing the crews trusted absolutely. The Panther's glacis plate was 80 millimeters of rolled steel, and it was laid back at 55 degrees from vertical. That slope is the part people forget. A round, striking angled plate has to bore through far more metal than the plate's actual thickness, and it tends to skate off rather than bite. Against a hit from the front, the effective protection of that glacis pushed past 140 millimeters. American tankers put round after round into Panther frontal armor at Normandy and watched them spark off and tumble away into the hedgerows. Word of that traveled in both armies. The Germans knew their front was, for practical purposes, a wall. The Americans knew it too, and that knowledge would decide more than it seemed to. So the German crewman buttoned up behind that. Glacis was not being arrogant. He was being correct within the terms of the fight he expected. Line up hull down on a ridge, let the enemy come across open ground, engage at 1,500 yards where his gun reached and theirs didn't. That was the fight the Panther was designed to win, and it won it more often than the numbers on paper suggested it should. Here is what that confidence quietly ignored. The wall was only a wall from the front. The Panther's side armor ran 40 to 50 millimeters, near vertical, and a 3-inch American round would go through it at combat range, like the slope was never there. The turret sides, the flanks, the rear, all of it was ordinary. A tank is only as protected as the plate facing the man shooting at it, and the entire German advantage depended on always facing the right way. That is a hard thing to guarantee when you cannot see. Manteuffel's brigades were also not the seasoned formation the reputation implies. Panzer Brigade 106 and its sister units had been thrown together fast, with fresh crews, and rushed into Lorraine short of the one thing that keeps armor alive: fuel, reconnaissance, and the time to learn the ground. They were moving in column, on roads, in fog, into country the Americans had already walked. Every one of those conditions stripped a layer off the advantage the crews were counting on. A German officer, reflecting afterward on how this kind of fight kept going wrong in the West, described the experience of being engaged by an enemy he could not locate and could not shake. What he actually said was blunter than any summary. The sense of it was that the initiative had simply passed to the other side, and his tanks were reacting to a battle someone else was running. That is not a man complaining about a bad tank. That is a professional describing a good tank used the wrong way, in the wrong weather, against men who had chosen the ground. The Panther that morning had everything it needed to win the fight it expected. What it did not have was any say in which fight it got, and the fight it got was decided by who saw whom first. A Wright R975 radial engine sits in the back of the M18, a 9-cylinder aircraft-derived power plant, putting out around 400 horsepower into a hull that weighed under 20 tons combat-loaded. Read that ratio again. A Panther carried a 700 horsepower engine and asked it to drag 45 tons through French mud. The Hellcat asked its engine to move less than half that. The result was a tank destroyer that could touch 55 miles an hour on a road, faster than most Jeeps, faster than anything with tracks had a right to go. That was the whole design philosophy, and it was a gamble. The Ordnance Department and the Tank Destroyer Command wanted a vehicle that could race to a threatened sector, kill armor, and be gone before the enemy could bring weight to bear. Speed was the armor. The M18 carried maybe half an inch to an inch of steel on its hull front, and its turret was open to the sky. A mortar splash, a strafing run, small arms fire from the wrong angle, any of them could reach the crew. The men who built it accepted every one of those risks to buy one thing, and they bought it in bulk. The gun was a 76mm 3-inch bore, firing armor-piercing rounds fast enough to defeat the Panther's flank at any range the crew was likely to see one. Against the glacis, that gun was a disappointment. American tankers cursed it in Normandy for exactly that. Against a side, a rear, a running column caught broadside, it was death delivered on time. Here is the doctrine that turned those numbers into a massacre. Tank destroyers were not meant to trade blows. They were meant to hide, wait, let the enemy present his flank, fire from concealment, then reverse out and reappear somewhere else before the return shot came. The Hellcat's speed did not win gunfights. It won the thing before the gunfight, the maneuver that decided which plate faced the muzzle. Now put that machine in Arracourt, a village alley, a hedgerow, a fold in the beet fields with a stone barn for cover. That is the M18's cathedral. The Panther needed distance and a clear line to use the gun it was built around. Cramped ground took that away. In close country, a Panther column moves in file, one tank's flank exposed to whatever waits beside the road, its long gun swinging slow, while the fog hides the thing that will kill it. The Hellcat crews did not fight the Panther's fight. They set an ambush and made the Panther walk into it, engine idling, 3-inch gun already laid on the spot where the next tank would appear. The traverse numbers tell the rest. A Hellcat's powered turret could swing all the way around in a handful of seconds. The crews trained to put a round on target and be moving before the smoke cleared. A Panther's turret ground around far slower, and a Panther that stops to hunt a hidden gun is a Panther presenting exactly the plate that gun wants. Every advantage the German machine had assumed, range, protection, first shot, depended on open ground and daylight. The fog and the alley took all three. There is a bitter symmetry in it. The Germans had invented the fast, concentrated armored punch, the blitzkrieg that ran over France in 1940. At Arracourt, the fast machine was American, and the German armor was the thing standing still, blind, waiting to be hit. The men who wrote the tank destroyer manual had studied that early German success and built a vehicle to punish it, not by matching armor, but by refusing to be where the armor was pointed. The trade was real, and it cost lives. Open-top tank destroyers took casualties that a buttoned-up Sherman would have shrugged off, and no Hellcat crewman was under any illusion about what a near miss meant. They ran that risk because the alternative was a fair fight against a Panther, and a fair fight against a Panther was a fight you lost. So the M18 went to Lorraine built for one specific murder, the flank shot from cover at a column that could not turn fast enough to answer. The German plan was about to hand it that shot 15 times over. All it needed was for Manteuffel's tanks to come down the road, in file, into the fog. They did. The German plan depended on speed, and speed was the one thing Lorraine refused to give it. On the 19th of September, 1944, Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army came on toward Nancy, convinced it was driving into a soft seam, a thin screen of American armor strung out at the end of a supply line that ran all the way back to the beaches. On the map, it looked like an open door. Patton's Third Army had outrun its own fuel weeks earlier. The front was a patchwork rather than a line, and German intelligence read the gaps as weakness. Hit hard, hit fast, roll up the flank before the Americans could concentrate. That was the theory, and the theory was not stupid. The ground had already voted against it. Lorraine in September is low, wet, and folded, a country of shallow valleys, beet fields turned to paste by the rain, stone villages sitting on the few pieces of hard road. Armor moving through it does not fan out into the broad wedges the manuals draw. It threads, following the tracks that will bear its weight, which means it moves in file, nose to tail, with its flanks hanging out over ditches and hedgerows it cannot see past. Every condition the Panther needed to fight well was missing here, and the men in the turrets did not yet know it. Then the fog came, and it changed everything the Germans thought they had. Morning after morning that week, a thick ground mist settled over the valleys and did not lift until midday. For an army built around the longshot, it was a catastrophe dressed as cover. The Panther's whole edge lived at 1,500 yards and beyond. In fog that closed visibility to a couple of hundred, the gun that could kill at 2,000 meters might as well not have existed. Manteuffel's crews rolled forward blind, trusting that the mist hid them as well as it blinded them. It did not. It hid the Americans better. The German planners never accounted for what waited in that mist. The 4th Armored Division was not the exhausted, overstretched screen they had penciled in. It was a rested, dug-in, thoroughly acquainted host, sitting on ground its crews had already patrolled and ranged. The tank destroyers of the 4th's attached battalion knew every road that would carry a Panther, and every fold that would hide a Hellcat. When the fog rolled the Germans forward, it rolled them into a killing box that had been laid out days in advance by men who understood exactly what the weather would do to a long-gun tank. The Germans thought the mist was their friend. It was working for the other side the entire time. That is the cruelty of the 19th. Manteuffel's lunge was not a blunder by an incompetent. He was one of the ablest armored commanders Germany produced, and his plan was sound against the enemy he believed he faced. What defeated it was a stack of small betrayals, each one invisible from a German turret, the fuel shortage that scattered his units and denied them proper reconnaissance, the soft ground that funneled him onto predictable roads, the fog that erased his gun's advantage, and the rested American division that was supposed to be a worn-out screen and was instead a coiled ambush. None of it announced itself. All of it was already true when the first Panther crossed the line of departure. The crews felt none of this as they advanced. They felt confidence. the reasonable earned confidence of men in the best medium tank in Europe, driving toward what they had been told was a broken enemy. They could hear their own engines and little else. They could see the tank ahead and the ditch beside them, and a wall of gray where the world used to be. Somewhere in that gray, on a fold of ground beside a village road, a handful of Hellcat crews sat with engines idling and 3-inch guns already laid on the spot where the fog would first give up a shape. They had chosen the ground and ranged it, and now they were waiting. The Panthers kept coming down the road, in file, exactly where the terrain said they would. And the fog that Manteuffel trusted to carry him into Nancy carried his lead tanks, instead, to within a few dozen yards of the guns waiting to kill them. Bézange-la-Petite is barely a village, a cluster of stone farm buildings, a church, one road running through it, and out into the beet fields. On the morning of the 19th, it is a wall of gray. The lead platoon of Charlie Company, 4th Tank Destroyer, the Hellcats of the 704th Battalion attached to the 4th Armored, sits off that road with engines idling, muzzles laid on a bend where the fog thins first. They do not fire when the first Panther appears. That is the part that reads wrong until you have thought about tank destroyer doctrine. A German medium tank rolls out of the mist at something under 100 yards, and the American gunners let it come, let it pass, let the second one follow, and the third, holding their fire, while the thing they came to kill fills the road in front of them. The urge to shoot the nearest threat is enormous. Discipline is the whole battle. Because a column presents its flank to whoever waits beside the road, and a flank is the only shot that matters. When the guns open, they open into side armor at about 200 yards, 40 to 50 millimeters of near vertical plate, exactly the number the 3-inch gun was built to defeat. The first rounds go through the way the manual promised. A Panther brews up in the road with a hole in its hull side, and the tank behind it now has a burning wreck blocking the one path the terrain allowed. The column is not a column anymore. It is a line of 45-ton vehicles with nowhere to go, in fog, taking fire from a direction their guns are not pointed. The German crews do exactly what training tells them. They traverse toward the muzzle flashes, and here the physics turns cruel. A Panther's turret grinds around slowly, and a Panther buttoned up in fog is a nearly blind machine hunting for a flash it half saw through a vision block. By the time the long 75 swings onto the spot where the shot came from, the Hellcat that fired it is already reversing out of its firing position, 400 horsepower hauling under 20 tons back behind a barn wall. The return round, when it comes, punches into stone or empty hedgerow. The gun that was supposed to kill at 2,000 meters cannot hit a thing at 200 that refuses to hold still, fire, kill, vanish, then do it again from somewhere else. The after-action reports of the 704th describe engagements measured in single-digit minutes and kills counted in the same breath. What they do not fully capture is what it was to be on the receiving end, and for that, the German side is the better witness. Manteuffel himself, assessing the Lorraine fighting afterward, put it plainly. His armor, he said, was being destroyed by an enemy it could not come to grips with. That is the sensation the doctrine was engineered to produce. Not a fair exchange of fire. An execution the victim never got to answer. Watch it from inside a German turret for one moment. The tank ahead of you erupts. The tank behind you stops. You hear a hammer blow of steel on steel somewhere in the gray, and you swing the turret toward it, and before your gunner can settle the sight, there is nothing there, just the sound of an engine winding up and pulling away, and you are alone in a stalled machine on a road you cannot leave, waiting for the next hit to arrive from a direction you have not guessed yet. The Hellcats took their own risks doing it. Open-topped, thin-skinned, they could not afford to be found, and a Panther that did get a shot off would not miss twice. But finding them was the problem the Germans could never solve that morning. Every time the fog gave up a target, it was a German target, and every time the Americans fired, they had already moved to where the return fire was not. Charlie Company's first pass cost the column its lead tanks and its momentum in a matter of minutes. That was the appetizer. The fog was still thick, the road was still the only road, and more Panthers were still coming down it, nose to tail, into ground the Americans had already ranged. What happened next, a few hundred yards on, was worse. The second gunner in line has his sight almost on it. A flash, low and to the right, a hard white bloom in the gray where a wall meets the road, and he lays the reticle onto the spot with the practiced speed of a man who has done this in Russia and lived. His foot is already coming off the traverse. The shape is gone, not moving, gone, the way a struck match is gone, and where it stood there is only stone, and the fading whine of an engine pulling backward through the murk. He fires anyway. Everyone does by now. A round into an empty hedgerow costs nothing and buys the illusion of doing something. That is the second cycle, and it is where the column stops being a fighting formation and becomes a queue. The lead tanks are burning across the only road. The tanks behind them have nowhere to turn, because the ditch on one side and the wet field on the other will swallow 45 tons of Panther and hold it there like a fly in resin. So they sit, engines running, guns hunting, and the Hellcats work down the line the way a man walks a fence checking posts, fire on the flank, reverse, cross behind a barn, reappear 30 yards on, laid on the next set of road wheels before the crew inside has understood the last one is dead. Read the German accounts of Lorraine, and one word keeps surfacing where you expect anger: nervous. Manteuffel's own men reported afterward that the fighting had made the Panzer crews nervous, jumpy, unsettled, firing at shadows. Their word. Think about what it takes to make veterans of the Eastern Front jumpy in the best medium tank on the continent. It was not the Hellcat's gun that did it, not exactly. It was the arithmetic of the thing. Every muzzle flash they saw was a tank of theirs already dying, and every flash they aimed at was empty ground. Inside a Panther, the fight has no front. That is the horror of it. A tank crew is trained to face a threat, to put the thick plate in the big gun between themselves and the enemy, to fight the ground in front of the hull. Here, there is no front. The killing comes from the right, then from behind, then from a gap in a wall that was quiet 10 seconds ago. The commander stands in the cupola, trying to read a wall of moving gray, knowing that to open the hatch wider is to invite a machine gun burst, and knowing that to stay buttoned is to stay blind. Either way, the next hammer blow is already on its way, and there is nothing in the manual for it. The hits come as sound before anything else. A Panther crew that survived one described it later not as an explosion, but as a single enormous impact, like the whole tank being struck by a falling building, and then the specific noises after, the sucking rush of a fuel fire finding air, the way a hatch that has been hit will not open. What the 3-inch round did to a Panther's flank at 200 yards was not dramatic from outside. One clean hole. Everything dramatic happened in the crew compartment, and still they could not find the guns. These were not frightened conscripts. They were professionals doing every correct thing, traversing to contact, returning fire, trying to push wrecks aside and keep moving. And every correct thing was answering a threat that had already relocated. The doctrine had anticipated exactly their competence and built a machine to render it useless. You cannot out-soldier a problem, where being fast and disciplined and brave only tells the enemy where to aim next. The column came apart from the inside, tank by tank, in the space of a morning, not overrun, dismantled. By the time the fog began to thin, the lead elements of Manteuffel's thrust toward Nancy were a line of burning and abandoned Panthers strung along a road they had never managed to leave, killed by an enemy most of the crews never clearly saw. The men who did it were already gone, repositioning, laying their guns on the next bend. There was more of the column still coming. 4 Shermans, 3 minutes, 5 Panthers dead before the 6th had finished its traverse. Those are the numbers Captain William Lameson's crews turned in on the morning of the 19th, and they read like a typographical error until you understand the ground he chose. Lameson commanded a company of the 37th Tank Battalion, the 4th Armored's own armor, M4 Shermans with the short 75, a gun that could not touch a Panther's frontal plate at any range that mattered. On paper, this is a losing trade. A Sherman that meets a Panther head-on at 1,000 yards is a dead Sherman. Lameson had no intention of meeting anyone head-on. He had a ridge. Word came that German tanks were working through the fog toward the American positions near Lisi, moving, as everything moved that morning, along the low ground the terrain allowed. Lameson took 4 tanks and ran them up the reverse slope of a rise the Panthers would have to pass beneath. Reverse slope. The phrase is dry, and the idea is not. A tank sitting just behind the crest is invisible to anything on the far side, and it can nose up over the top, fire, and back down into cover in the time it takes a man to say it. The Panthers were below him, and to the flank, in file, exactly where the fog and the road had put them. The short 75 had one thing it could do. It could not punch a Panther's front, but from a height, onto the thinner top and side, and rear armor of a tank whose long gun was pointed the wrong way, it did not need to. Lameson's crews came over the crest already laid roughly where the column would be, and the range was under 1,000 yards, and the Germans were looking anywhere but up at the ridge behind them. The first Sherman fired. A Panther stopped. What happened in the next 180 seconds is recorded in the battalion's own account, and the count is 4. 4 Panthers killed before the German crews below could work out where the fire was coming from and grind their turrets around to answer it. That is the whole margin. A Panther's turret traverse was slow, and slow against a gun already on target from above is fatal. Lameson's gunners were shooting a stationary column from a fixed ranged position. The Germans were solving a geometry problem with a hydraulic traverse that would not turn fast enough to save them. Then, Lameson did the part that separates a lucky ambush from a doctrine. He pulled back over the crest, all 4 tanks, down the reverse slope, out of sight, before the surviving Panthers could register the ridge and put fire on it. To the Germans below, the guns that had just killed 4 of their number simply stopped existing. The crest went quiet, the slope showed nothing, and any return round they sent up went into empty grass and air. The Shermans ran laterally behind the ridge, reappeared over a different stretch of crest, and did it again. This is the same arithmetic the Hellcats were working a few miles off, run by a different machine with a worse gun, and the same idea underneath it. Fire from a place the enemy has not accounted for. Kill what you can, in the seconds before he adjusts, then vanish behind cover before the adjustment arrives and let him hunt the empty ground while you set up somewhere new. The Sherman was not supposed to beat the Panther. Used like this, on ground like this, the contest was never Sherman against Panther. It was a gunner who could see against a gunner who could not. By the time Lameson's company was finished, the tanks it had engaged were burning in the low ground, and the men who killed them had lost, by the battalion's reckoning, nothing. The figure the after-action report settles on is lopsided past the point of comment. The Germans lost a column. The Americans lost paint. Lameson was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for the morning's work. The citation is spare about the method. It notes the ridge, the withdrawal, the repositioning, the count. The fog was thinning now across the whole sector. What it uncovered, up and down those valleys, was the same picture repeated. Panthers stopped along the roads, hatches open, killed from angles their crews never turned to face. Panzer Brigade 113 was as good as destroyed. That is not an American claim. It is the assessment that comes back through the German command after the 19th, the number that ends the argument. A fresh Panther Brigade, committed to a fog-covered thrust that was supposed to unhinge the American line, and by the time the mist lifted, it had ceased to exist as a fighting formation. The tally that gets repeated is 15-3. 15 Panthers dead against 3 Hellcats lost in one action, in one morning. Sources differ on the exact count across the whole sector. The 4th Armored's books and the German returns do not line up to the tank, but no version makes it close. The best of them makes it a massacre. Here is what the numbers do not say out loud. Manteuffel had launched the counterattack to restore momentum, to take Nancy, to prove that German armor could still cut an American spearhead at the root. What the counterattack actually produced was the opposite of every one of those things. It burned his lead brigade, it froze his advance, and it handed the initiative to the exact enemy it was meant to dislodge. An operation designed to seize ground ended by teaching the men who ran it that they could not move on that ground at all, while the Americans held the flanks. The Foreign Military Studies reports are the tell. After the war, German generals sat down for the U.S. Army and wrote out what had beaten them. And on Lorraine, the language turns careful in a way that is its own kind of confession. They do not blame the fog alone, nor the fuel alone, though the tanks were thirsty and the trucks were late. What surfaces again and again is the American use of terrain and the speed with which those light guns appeared, killed, and were gone before an answer could be aimed. The men writing those reports had commanded panzers from the Bug to the Meuse. They chose their words like men explaining a thing they still found unreasonable. One of them put the failure down to the impossibility of closing with an enemy who would not stand and fight the way armor was supposed to. That is a compliment, whether he meant it as one or not. The whole German method rested on grip. Fix the enemy, mass against him, break him with concentrated shock. The Americans at Arracourt refused to be gripped. They would not present a front to be massed against. They fired from the side and the rear and the reverse slope, and then they simply were not there. And a doctrine built on the decisive clash found nothing to clash with. Go back to the alley in Arracourt one last time. The Panther is still there, cold, one track off, the long gun aimed at a wall. Now the single hole in the turret side has a whole morning behind it. It was put there by a machine that weighed less than half what its victim weighed, carried a gun that could not have touched that Panther from the front, and won anyway. Because the crew that fired it had seen the Panther first, shot the flank, and reversed out before the 75 could come around. The Germans understood the trick completely by noon and could do nothing with the understanding. Knowing you are being killed from the flank does not help if you cannot find the flank that is killing you. The smell was the last thing to go. Diesel and cordite and scorched paint hanging in the low ground for days. Over Panthers with their hatches flung open where the crews got out, or did not. The fog that Manteuffel had trusted to carry him into Nancy had instead delivered his tanks, in file, at close range, to gunners who wanted exactly that. The brigade that was going to take a city lost its armor on a stretch of farm road and never reached the outskirts. The Americans lost 3 tank destroyers, and by 1 battalion's dry reckoning, some paint. There is no monument at the bend where Charlie Company's guns waited. There does not need to be. The proof is in the German after-action file, in the careful sentences of men who had won everywhere else and could not explain the one place they lost, written for the enemy who beat them, in the enemy's archive, in their own hand. The M18 Hellcat ended the war with the highest confirmed kill-to-loss ratio of any American armored fighting vehicle, and the number is not close to second place. The tank destroyer battalions that fielded it claimed roughly 526 enemy tanks and assault guns, knocked out against 112 Hellcats lost, better than 4-1, in a vehicle with armor you could defeat with a heavy machine gun from the right angle. Read that ratio the wrong way, and it looks like a miracle. It wasn't a miracle. It was a wager that paid. The Army had bet on a specific idea and built a specific machine to serve it. Tank destroyers would not slug it out with armor. They would find it, hit it from a place it was not watching, and be gone before it turned. Everything about the Hellcat served that one sentence: the 55 miles per hour. The open-top turret that let a commander hear and see the whole fight instead of squinting through a slit. The 3-inch gun that could not crack a Panther's glacis, but tore its flank open at any range a crew would actually fire from. Take the plate off, spend the weight on speed, win the argument about who shoots first. Here's the part the doctrine's own authors got wrong. The tank destroyer concept was, by 1945, considered a near failure inside the U.S. Army. General McNair had built the branch to blunt massed Panzer breakthroughs, and those breakthroughs mostly never came the way he pictured them. The board that reviewed the war recommended killing the whole idea. They killed it. By 1946, the tank destroyer branch was gone, folded into armor, its doctrine discarded, its vehicles sent to scrap, or to allies, or to gate guards. So the machine with the best kill ratio America ever fielded was retired by the same institution it had served, judged a dead end almost the moment the shooting stopped. Both things are true, and that is the open question I will leave you with. Was Arracourt proof the doctrine worked, or proof that a good crew on good ground wins with almost anything you hand them? The men of the 4th Armored had range cards drawn, flanks covered, fog on their side, and a road the Germans could not leave. Give those same crews Shermans, Lamison did, 4 miles away, and got the same result on a ridge. Maybe the Hellcat was the reason. Or maybe it was just the fastest way to be where the enemy was not. The FMS reports credit the terrain and the tactics before they credit the vehicle, and those reports were written by the men who lost. I lean one way. The gun that reversed out of the alley before the 75 came around was doing something no Sherman could have done as fast, and speed was the whole trade. But I hold it loosely, because the record has two fathers, and only one of them was the machine. What is not in question is the morning. 15 Panthers, one narrow sector, a brigade written off in a German war diary before noon. The Hellcat itself did not last long as a fighting vehicle. Post-war, the survivors went the way surplus armor goes, cut up for scrap, sold to Yugoslavia and other armies who ran them into the 1950s. A handful kept back by the U.S. for testing and then forgotten in motor pools. The Wright radial that made it fast was worth more as an idea than the hull was as steel. A few are left. One sits at the Patton Museum collection at Fort Knox, restored. The open turret exactly as a gunner would have stood in it. Another actually runs, engine and tracks, at a private collection in the Midwest that takes it out for wartime commemorations. The 9-cylinder radial still throwing that same flat bark across a field in Ohio. There are M18s on concrete plinths outside a VFW hall or two, repainted olive drab, the 3-inch gun pointed at a parking lot. Arracourt is farmland again. The road through Bézange-la-Petite is paved now, running between beet fields that were beet fields then, past stone farm buildings that took the machine gun fire and still stand. On a foggy September morning, the low ground fills exactly the way it filled in 1944, and you cannot see the far end of the road.